Hi, my name's McGregor. I studied arts and law in Western Australia and graduated in 2008. In 2010, I qualified in Western Australia, and I recently moved to London in 2011 to work in a city law firm, and I recently sat the QLTS exams and passed the first time. It was perhaps more a matter of necessity than desire. When I arrived in London, I realised that the QLTT had been replaced by the QLTS, which was a much more rigorous exam. A lot of employers in the city prefer their solicitors to have dual qualifications these days if they're from overseas. So I realised that I'd need to sit the exams, and the sort of means to the end was the QLTS. I think because the exams are relatively new, there's not a lot of knowledge about them out there. And because I was also working at the time, I thought it'd be very helpful to have some legal training provided, particularly materials which reflect the actual content of the exams. So at that stage I decided I needed someone to actually give me a bit of a hand, so I didn't have to do all the legwork myself, at which stage I started looking for a legal training provider. It was December last year, and I realised that the materials I had for the MCT from another provider weren't particularly helpful. They were massive in terms of their length and not particularly focused on the actual areas I saw were covered in the exam. So I started looking around for another legal training provider, and QLTS School was actually one of the first I came across, and I sort of called them up in terms of making a general inquiry. And the person I spoke to was extremely helpful and started to give me the sort of practical advice on the exam, which I hadn't had to that point. So actually signing up for QLTS School was quite an easy decision. I think the multiple choice question banks were particularly useful. They simulated the format and style of the questions in the exam, and I've probably found them a little bit more difficult actually, so that prepared me well for the actual exam. And also the summary materials for the MCT were useful. Initially, probably sort of 2 months before the exam, I was spending a few hours every week, work permitting, reviewing materials, and it was really in the sort of 2 or 2.5 weeks for the exam when I put my head down and really got into it. They were. They paid for my tuition and for me to sit the exams, which are actually quite expensive. They also gave me 10 days of study leave, which was quite useful, particularly because I was working up till the point before the exam. And generally there was a level of sympathy from other overseas lawyers who had gone through the system and perhaps had an easier route through the QLTT. I think it's certainly going to help in the long term being qualified in 2 jurisdictions, and employers these days in the city rather, I think are increasingly preferring their solicitors to have an English qualification, which in the long term I think will put me in good stead. Firstly, good luck. It is challenging, but mainly in terms of the time commitment. If you do have enough time to prepare, I think you'll be fine with a bit of perseverance. I think the main challenge actually lies in the sheer breadth of material you're asked to learn. And coming from Australia, I was fairly comfortable with things like contract and tort, but you did actually have to learn a lot of other things like police powers, EU law, and criminal law, which a practicing commercial lawyer from overseas might not be so familiar with. In terms of the MCT, it's probably the more academically challenging part of the process, and probably not challenging so much in the sense that each question is very rigorous, but in the sense that there is just a huge amount of material you need to know. In terms of the OSCE, I think you need to remember that it's not so much about your legal knowledge, but about your interviewing skills. So it's quite important to just try and put the interviewer, who's actually an actor, at ease and just elicit the right information from them. In terms of the TLST, it's more about your skills at actually using online resources rather than having a huge sort of wealth of knowledge. But at the same time, you do need to know a lot about the areas you're asked to cover. So for me, it was sort of conveyancing and property and probate that I focused on because they're not sort of my cup of tea. But at the same time, it does come down to your skills in the end. I'd recommend the QLTS to anyone who's thinking about working in England as a lawyer for the long term. And in terms of how much time you need to allocate it to, I'd probably start studying a few months before each exam, depending on your other work or commitments outside of work.